record? No housekeeping or anything? Okay, great. And we are live. Welcome to episode 14 of Fair Go Basic Income Discussion Group. We're joined by Loriana Luccioni, and we'll be discussing basic income and the discourse. I have to start with an apology. I've preemptively and unilaterally called Loriana Dr. Loriana Luccioni in the promotional materials. That's my error. Loriana has finished her PhD, but she hasn't actually been awarded the title of doctor until a couple of weeks left. So couple of weeks from now, is that right, Loriana?
It's under examination, so it might be a bit longer, hopefully no longer than a month, but yeah. Okay,
well, I'm so excited and eager about your PhD that I've jumped the gun there. But how about we start with, I always abuse my privilege as a Zoom host of these meetings. And I always ask the first question. And my question in this case is just if you tell us in as plain and simpler language as you possibly can, you know, what was your PhD about? Which is kind of a hard question, I know.
So how many hours do I have to answer this question?
Let's try and keep it to the first 5 minutes, because other people will have more questions for you as well. But let's say 5 minutes per question, and then everyone will get a chance to ask one, and we'll try and keep it as, you know, take your time, don't rush, but also perhaps not the doctorate level for us.
Yes. Yeah, I will try to be as clear and simple as I can. So I came to the Universal Basic Income debate, literature discussion, from an activist perspective. So from an advocacy, an activist perspective. And I was really interested in the strategic ways in which a universal basic income could be implemented in a Western country. And I was here in Australia. That's where my activism was primarily. So that's how I decided to do this study here in this context. So as I was involved within the debate and I was reading the literature, I could see that what was really lacking was a sound discussion about framing of the policy. How do we tell the story of a universal basic income? What are the underlying values? What are what I call the social imaginary? So what are these future vision that we have in mind, you know, and they're very diverse, like many different people advocate for a universal basic income because they are imagining very different kind of society. So that was my entry point. That was like, I was interested in investigating what are the values that are structuring these different narratives to advocate for a universal basic income. And at the time, so when this all started to coalesce in my mind, between 2016 till 2018, I started a PhD in 2018. One of the primary ways in which universal basic income was advocated was in this very economistic or techno-rational arguments, which came later on, but you might remember Andrew Young campaign for the presidential election.
It was cheaper to pay it than not to pay it arguments.
Yes, exactly. Yes. And also like strongly linked to other narratives around automation and loss of job. So yes, in very, you know, what to me, they were like very cold, calculative ways, which good, they do work, they do function for certain constituency, but it wasn't really questioning the deeper, the bigger discourse, the hegemonic discourse in which all of this operates, which is the neoliberal, neoconservative discourse. It was what Andre Gortz called a reformist reform. So it was one in many ways in which we are creating patches, you know, to partially fix the system, but not in an aim to revolutionize the system. So I was more interested into, okay, but how about if we use a universal basic income and we look at what are the radical potential of this policy, and how do we frame it in a national context if this is what we want to achieve. And also I like Eric Olin Wright, because I think he has a beautiful way of expressing this variation of goalposts for a policy. So are we aiming at eroding capitalism, smashing capitalism? What do we want to do with what we advocate? Yes, this is how I came to my study, and what I did, I looked at language in use among what I described, and this is of course controversial, for the ordinary citizens. So by ordinary, I meant people that did not have a direct stake in the debate. They were not experts in the debate. And by citizen and permanent resident, I included all people that have a legal right and duty to vote into Australia, in like the Australian political system. So that was the sample, and it was randomized. And what I did were focus groups. So I had all these different people coming from different background. I put them in a room for 2 hours, and I asked them to deliberate. So the question was, would you like a universal basic income being implemented in Australia? Yes or no? And after the first hour, they had to come up with a deliberation. And I used this particular design because, you know, like when we do surveys or polling or any kind of statistics, really, we do get an answer. We might have a yes or no answer, but we do not know the underlying reasons. What are the values, you know, the framing that are structuring these reasons? Like, why do we like something and not something else? So in a deliberative forum, you can actually observe these changing attitudes and opinions as people coming from very different backgrounds, stories, ideologies, values. They try to reach a common agreement. And by doing this, you can have access to the deeper value frames. So what are these values that people will not compromise on? And I did this, so I had 7 focus groups. And out of these 7 focus groups, 6 deliberated for the desirability. So they wanted a universal basic income implemented in Australia, and only 1 deliberated for the undesirability of the policy. So once I had these results, of course, how do you go?
We won, right? That means we won, didn't we? Yay! Sorry.
Yes, but of course, it's not a representative study. You know, I had like 30, bit less than 30 participants in total. So it was a very deep qualitative study. But
for anyone who's watching, I will just say that the big picture surveys that have been done of the Australian population do show strong support for a basic income and anti-poverty measures and stuff like that as well. Just for anybody who's at home watching, that's also the case in the broader case studies. But sorry, please. I'm very interested in what you're in what were the values that these people what were the commonalities and the values expressed.
And that is where like the most astonishing results are, I believe, because when I did a thematic analysis, critical discourse analysis to uncover, so what were these underlying values, and they are, I listed them so I can read them out for you. Well, somewhere like. It's interdependency, compassion, reciprocity. I have them somewhere. Like it's actually what some of them. So you had frames like self-worth comes through contribution, and of course the whole meaning of contribution was enlarged to include all different forms and recognize.
So it was enlarged through the course of the discussion. You could see it take place in these discussions on a recurring basis. That what people considered people said, well, if someone's doing this, they're contributing, and then that shopping list was expanded, and as people heard other perspectives.
Yes, and more importantly, there was this strong link between the concept of self-worth. So as we as humans, how we construct self-worth, like why are we worthy? Why are we here? We do it by contributing to society, but this concept of contribution was expanded. So it did include a variety of activity, care and paid employment, but artistic endeavor, and in some cases, even states of being, not just doing. So, contemplative states, those also were recognized as giving sense of self-worth. Then human life as intrinsic value. This was another dominant frame that came up. Happiness is relational. Human flourishing and risk-taking attitudes rely on collective trust in individual sense and enactment of autonomy. So this is a bit complex. Let me break it down for you. So if, as a collective, we trust individuals to be autonomous beings, that is what allows the individual to actually take ownership of this and to flourish and to take risks, because it feels the support and the recognition of the collective, of this inherent autonomy. Generosity precedes reciprocity, and that, of course, this is a key ingredient anytime you talk about unconditional policy. So you need to give something, without expectation of return, and that's very interesting because it touches on all the philosophy of the gift and how different it is from the principles on which Western, particularly Anglo-Saxon social policy welfare systems are built. What is this principle of reciprocity? So yes, these were among the frames, the predominant frames that came up across these focus groups. And another very interesting result is that none of these groups, so they did deliberate to have they did desire a universal basic income, but not on its own. So in none of the group it came up like the more left libertarian or right libertarian framing of a universal basic income, where you might not necessarily need a welfare state anymore. There were certain policies, particularly public and free education, public and free healthcare. There was no mention around, there was some mention, but it was not important, the whole debate around wage regulation. That was not necessarily something that my participants were demanding, but yeah, it was healthcare, education, were the two true across the 6 focus groups. And then, you had other smaller debate, about so what we do about disability benefits. There were other debates in terms of funding. Would it be best funded by sovereign wealth fund? And, all variations like that led to other very interesting discussions. So you do see, like again, across the 6 focus groups, that a universal basic income was desired as part of a broader policy package of change.
That reminds me of in 2019 or whenever it was that Andrew Yang was running, I saw this polling data about Iowa, so these early primary states where he needed to win big in one of these early primary states to suddenly be a player and for the miracle to happen, right? And they showed huge support for basic income among the people who were going to actively participate in the primaries, right? And the candidate that all of I think close to majority or majority support, who said, yeah, we want a basic income. And all of those people were going to vote for Bernie Sanders, right? Who wasn't running on a basic income, but was running on healthcare, wages, blah, blah, blah. Of course, you could say, well, they thought that he was a more viable candidate and they were voting strategically. Or you could say, no, Andrew Yang wasn't reflecting back to this passionate community the right values, which I think is kind of the case you're making to the basic income community, is that it shouldn't be this technocratic, nobody's offended sounding thing. It should be, part of a broader vision that includes these other policies.
Yes, exactly. So on a more like practical level, it includes other policy, but again, at a more framing, narrative, value discourse level, it's really centered again about the values of interdependency, between each other. So it's none of them framed it as, this is the biggest scare among left left of the political spectrum detractor of a universal basic income, because they see it is a very individualizing policy that might lead to the worst case scenario of us just being consumer, like duped and be given money to consume. So none of the parties, and again, it's not generalizable, but I think it's important that none of them saw universal basic income, in terms of this individualistic freedom. Of course, there was a component of that. Why not? Like, they all desire more free time to do and invest in things that they do like. But it was really this concept of freeing humans in terms of flourishing as individuals, but that as a ripple-on effect as a collective. So interdependency, there was a strong one that came up.
I would, like, one of the things that I used to work as a journalist, and one of the things that it came to me towards the end of my career as a journalist was that in politics, and when you're talking, the politics of the general public is ambiguous, right? And that's sometimes seen as, it's incoherent. They don't know what they really want. Like, my favorite example, I always talk about Egypt because it was what I knew best, right? So my favorite example is there that a huge number of people said they supported Sharia law, and then a huge number of people also said they supported democracy. And so they're saying yes to both of these things. And to us, that sounds crazy. But like with these discussion groups that you had, what people obviously can have individualistic and collective drives in parallel without sort of, working out the equation and how it all plugs in some really sophisticated way. They just kind of chew gum and walk at the same time, right? Does it have to be collectivist versus individual? Did you see a conflict in the groups?
No, and if there were, it was interesting because you could see, so I also approached this research from my psychology background. And there is this concept in psychology, which is what you're talking about. And we call it cognitive polyphasia, when we have different frames of understanding the word and they all coexist and they don't make any, within ourselves.
This is not cognitive dissonance, which is the one you always hear about.
No, this is
and this is where it's a positive thing, right?
Yeah. There is polis, so it's multiple cognitive system coexisting, and lack of as well. It's very similar to this concept of biconceptualism, where you have people holding liberal and conservative values, but in different areas of the life, and that does not make them less functional or less coherent. So it doesn't.
It may actually make them much more functional because they're able to calibrate their operating system to different contexts. Yeah.
And that's also us. We all have this. Sometimes when you bring them to consciousness, there's a bit of contradiction there, but we are all living contradictory beings. That's another thing.
So I'm going to ask people to start putting their hands up and asking questions. So if you want to ask your question, just put your hand up using the Zoom function, and we'll try and get your questions answered in the order that the hands go up. Does anybody? I haven't said that yet, so someone might be waiting. Josh beat you to it, Stephen. We're going to do Josh. Loriana will respond, and then we'll come to Stephen.
I'm kind of curious if you saw people changing their minds throughout the process, either as a group or individually.
Yeah, there were the only group that deliberated against universal basic income was, to me, the most fascinating. In fact, is the only one that I devoted a whole chapter just to that group. So at the end of the deliberation, there was no shift. But throughout the deliberation, you can see how different arguments put forward and how the person was reacting and changing their own position. And in fact, for this group, I produced this table where I can say, okay, this frame is effective with people coming from a more social conservative background. This frame is not effective at all. And it's from this group that I got the conclusion that economistic and techno-rational cost-benefit framing are not efficient and effective, where we're trying to communicate with people that are it's not even detractors, but, they are sitting on the fence. If they're sitting on the fence and you use these discourses, they are easily co-opted, by the old conservative deservingness, undeservingness frame, or like a good one about economistic framing every time. So there was one of the participants that it was sitting on the fence, but it was the only one trying and pushing, like making this debate a bit more active. But unfortunately, his whole framing was very economistic, cost-benefit analysis. And it was always like the reply he was getting, like there was the most stark one. It was, well, we don't need it now. It's not urgent. So yeah, I can see it makes rational sense, but we don't see the urgency for introducing it now. That one was fascinating. So there were some shifts in individual stance, nothing radical, but in a way, I think at least within the research setting. So why I'm saying this, because these people might have changed their opinion, or they might have compromised some of the values within that setting. But, maybe as soon as they walk out and they go back in the same environment, in the same echo chambers, that is not a long-lasting effect. So, but within the research setting, yes, there were shifts and adjustments. And, this, I think in the spirit of deliberation, in the spirit of let's try to find an agreement here.
And it's also an exercise, isn't it?
Yes.
Right? And they know it's an exercise, and the goal of the exercise is to reach a consensus, and they want to succeed at the exercise, and there's no other stakes.
Yes.
So, should we go to Stephen?
Yeah, so how would you make UBI a major serious policy option for mainstream Australian society? How would you go about it, for example?
So again, I cannot generalize the data, but what was quite obvious to me is that it needs to be framed around these different values that I'm talking about. It really needs to offer a radically different vision to people. And we are not even talking about, the established political party system. We have seen an increment in disillusionment with politics itself, and increasing uncertainty and anxiety, particularly in this past 2 years and with everything that is happening. And it seems that historically, one of the biggest, it's not a mistake, it's just something that the left misses, and there are reasons why, but this capacity to offer a counter hegemony, to offer similar like to the Green New Deal, like something big, like that is the vision, that is the utopia. Like, are we going to achieve it? Maybe not in that way, but something that people can look at and hope for and struggle towards. And this does require big policies like universal basic income to be framed in these terms. I'm not saying necessarily the one that I find, which would be amazing, in terms of interdependency, compassion, generosity precedes reciprocity, which might eventually come. But here we are talking about generational changes. Like, it takes time to achieve cultural change. It's really this, like, how do we change the deeper values on which our society?
Did your research show that we need to change the values to achieve a basic income, or does it show that people's values are already aligned with a basic income?
Second. So it shows that people, and this is why I'm saying the framing should change, because this is what...
The only thing that's not aligned is the rhetoric of people like Andrew Yang, who'd say this is a really clever wonky policy that's going to solve all our problems because I'm so good at maths.
Yes. And again, like, these people did see the benefit of that rhetoric as well. They did see it, like, it's part. We do, at the end of the day, live in a system where cost-benefit analysis are useful. So they do see a benefit in having that part of argumentation as well, but not as central stage. So again, why do people desire a universal basic income? What are the underlying values and reasons? And these are the ones that I found. And at the same time, I was also able to assess which one are not effective. And
so we could speak to the values that people have when we're campaigning for basic income. Jane has her hand up. You're muted, Jane.
Yes, sorry. I missed the very beginning, Loriana, but I was wondering if you'd had the opportunity to talk to any groups who'd been involved in any of the recent disasters, like the bushfires, the floods.
Hi, Jane. Anyway, no, I didn't, because my research. So I collected the data in early 2019. Yeah. So, and at the time, and it was based in Brisbane. So my sample was based in Brisbane. Of course, with all the comes with it.
Yeah. Hinges with what you've been talking about. It's very heartening to hear that those groups were far more interested in the collective effect than the individual and didn't see any contradiction. But it strikes me every time I look at what's happening in Lismore, I think what I was thinking when I was looking at what was happening in all those south coast towns during the fires. These are really easily delimited areas where you can demonstrate without too much difficulty that who's a genuine resident and who's, you know, been a participant in the loss and the disaster, and who has a stake in the collective recovery. And it would be ideal circumstances for a government trial if we could just really push the persuasion. Because when you think in the aggregate, everything else looks ridiculous. A loan looks ridiculous. How can you, when you've suffered like that, ever be in a position to pay back a loan? But basic income does it in reverse. It says, look, you'll have something right now in your bank account. It may not do, but if you need to take a loan on your own terms, you'll know this will still be there boosting you in 5 years' time, when it will be easier for you to maybe pay back if you needed a lump sum now. So you can balance, but the community as a whole can balance. They can collectively invest, and they can invest in the actual hard physical work of recovery, like everything from cleaning up to mending fences to, you know, taking care of injured animals. It just is crying out as a situation that needs to be targeted for these policies. I wondered what your thoughts were around that.
No, yes, absolutely. And, you know, it could be not only extremely effective in terms of helping the people right now, you know, but it's also, yeah, could make very interesting pilot for a basic income in Australia. And as you were talking about, you know, the collectivist values and, you know, people recovering as a community, another thing that came up in my research is around these communitarian values. You know, maybe because you missed the intro, but there was this very strong view, like universal basic income was mainly seen as a way, you know, to flourish, to help everyone flourish in a community, more than on individualistic terms, even if those were recognized. So, like, I was fairly amazed to see how much people saw it as a benefit to the community at large. So probably, particularly in these situations, even more so. Yeah, that's. I don't know if I'm.
Yeah, thank you. It's just so promising.
So at one stage, Loriana, I think you said earlier on that people didn't focus on consumption when they were talking about a basic income. The conversation wasn't, oh, well, I can go out and consume all this other stuff. Does your, but I was is consumption a dirty word on the left, and what is that, and what does that mean, say about our values, right? And is it possible that maybe the left's values are a little bit too dour and a little bit too anti-fun and anti-individualist, and that's one of the reasons we're not able to get ideas like a basic income across the line?
Yeah. So consumerism, and consumption was indeed touched, and in fact, none of these participants was arguing for complete removal of markets and markets relationship. But the way they were articulating consumption within a basic income, they did see it as a way, and you can find even in the literature, you find quite strongly this argument as a way of making consumption more sustainable, more ethical. And as people have more money, they might be able to make, inverted commas, better consumer choices, so to spend more for what might be high quality but long lasting product rather than a cheap, short-lived product. So they did there was quite a bit of reflection around how consumption patterns might change and be affected, but consumption was not debated. And before, I made this little mention about wage regulations. That was another interesting finding in my research, that although again these participants wanted a more direct and active role of the state, particularly around the areas of education and health, they did not think, and this again was true across the focus groups, that wage relations should be regulated or over-regulated by the states with a universal basic income. And in here, you can see this contrast between wanting some of the paternalism, that we inherit from welfare states, and that we see as a collective, and therefore there are some basic rights like health and education that should be guaranteed equally and shared. And so we talk about risk pooling, and resource sharing and so on. So there is a big space for that and demand for that, but there is also big space and demand for independence as market actor, and the wage relation is seen as one of the ingredients of these market actors. So it's and this also links with the strike fund argument, and the empowering of employees. So if I have more of a say about my job contract, my employment, then basically leave it on the people to decide what's their worth and establish this relationship, this market relationship between employer and employee.
So they do have faith in the idea of the worker being able to bargain if the gun of poverty and destitution is not pointed at the worker's head during that negotiation.
Yes.
But did in those conversations, was there talk about unions and collective bargaining? Did that enter the conversation on many occasions?
Yes, not really. It was just one focus group that mentioned unions, and there wasn't really much talk about the use of unions. It was in passing, because you see, unions they will keep on adding a role, which is essential. And unions' role is not only about wage regulation. So right now I don't remember, but it was in passing, and it was.
So it wasn't one of the main topics of discussion when people were discussing. Let's go. I don't remember whether Josh or Stephen put their hand up first now. I'm going to go with Stephen this time.
Yeah.
Because I went with Josh last time.
Did anyone talk about poverty? What was their attitude to poverty in society?
So thank you for this question. It's interesting because so I did not collect social demographic data. So I did not know the socioeconomic background or any other demographics of the people coming in. And I did this. This has to do with a theoretical outlook, so non-essentialism. So I did not want to put people in boxes. Okay. So I didn't know where these people were coming from, but of course you can infer something about the life story as they talk. And there were some people, which I cannot confirm because, again, I don't have this data, but based on what they were saying and the perspective they were putting forward, that were living on Centrelink. So, and the view of poverty, that is interesting. It did come up in the debate. There was, even in the groups that supported a universal basic income, there were parts of the debate that they did revolve around concepts of deservingness and undeservingness. And they were, of course, overcome in recognition of the benefits of unconditionality, but they were there. And I mean, we would fool ourselves thinking that weren't there, since these kind of discourses around, the welfare system, the dole bludger stigma, they are so embedded in the system that even people in receipt of the benefit see themselves as in some way inferior. Like there was one of it's amazing. It's years ago, but something that just sticks in your mind. And one of the participants, so he was super supportive of universal basic income, but in the way he was talking about himself and his relationship with Centrelink, he appropriated that identity of the dole bludger on himself. So even if, like, on the outside, so he could see the inequality and the power dynamics going on within the deservingness undeservingness debate, and he was critical of that. But when he was talking about himself, he was kind of embodying part of this role. So there was another interesting contrast, going back to the
dole bludger pride, or dole, was he sort of expressing it like a badge of pride, like a defiant kind of attitude?
Yes, in this case was dole bludger pride, but I had other cases where people were more like used to be put in a perspective where they had to justify themselves, and it's like it was showing how hard it is for people that have been in the system for a long time to actually see that, well, this is not charity, I'm not a supplicant.
I remember once, I'll go to Josh in a second, I just want to make this one observation. A very clever person once said to me, you might argue with your parents and you might fight with your parents, but you always do so by using their own values back at them. You don't try and tell your parents that your values are best. You try and show them that they're not living up to their own values when you argue with your parents. Is often the dynamic. It sounds like a similar thing.
And I want to go back to that because that's very important when we frame debates.
Josh.
Okay, so at some point during your research, you interviewed myself, you interviewed David Upton, and a few other basic income advocates. I'm just wondering if anything came of that was interesting.
Yeah, so that was another research. That was like the publication in the Caputo book. Yes, that was very interesting. It's still within this bigger philosophy. Like I was looking, is there an emergent narrative? Is there a stronger narrative and way of looking and arguing for a universal basic income? And again, the most stark difference among, the four, you were one of them, the four activists that I interviewed, was more in terms of funding, and how you, and of course with funding, like it comes with a lot of background assumptions and values themselves, whether do you want to fund it through taxes on labor or through GST or through sovereign wealth fund. It comes from very different views in which we see the economy and in which we see our role in it as contribution. But yeah, there was, I gave it a name. I don't remember like in the book how I called it, but it's like a synthesis. So there was a synthesizing of your arguments around some deeper core reframing, which of course didn't come as stark. It wasn't as deep at the discussion that I had with the participants because I had more people interacting and I don't want to use the word compromise, but getting deeper about the values. But that was interesting, and it was like in a similar line of thought but it was just like talking to to people more involved in the debate and in advocacy.
Emma.
Sorry, before I forget, what you said about the parents' arguments. In Lakoff and Johnson literature, that they do talk about how to effectively frame messages, particularly in politics. And there is this book you might know, like Don't Think of an Elephant. And every time when we are in a debate with someone, like, and we might disagree radically, like on some deep radical values, we often fall in this inverted comma mistake of denying them, responding to them in this negative attitude. But what we are doing, we are actually reinforcing.
We're talking about the elephant.
Yes, exactly. And this is like when I go and discuss the finding of the only focus group that did not want a universal basic income, I could find all these instances. And this is why I was able to say, well, this frame is ineffective because it's not putting forward a new way of seeing things, a new way of looking at things, a new language. Is just responding like negatively to that. So it's reinforcing.
That's why I say when people ask me, how do we pay for a basic income? I say, we're going to charge a stupid question tax. And every time somebody asks me that question, they're going to pay this tax and we'll fund it in no time, right? And refuse to go down this, it's a trap line. Like if whatever, we'll figure it out. And what you want, and I love to do it. I had a friend that I was out with the other night, and he was saying, because I'm a believer that we can have, shiny technological future and save the planet. And he's like, no, we have to like consume less and live in smaller huts. And I just said to him, but if we could have shiny flying cars, would you want them, or would you prefer to go back to the mud hut and the cottage families? Well, actually, and then you realize what the actual disagreement is, right? And it's the same. You say to these people, well, if we could have a basic income, would you want one? And then you start the real discussion. Yeah, if we could afford it, would you like it then? Sorry, Emma, I'm eating into your question time. Go ahead.
It's kind of related to my question, I guess. So I feel like a lot of these, the arguments that, like Andrew Yang and other technocrats have, they are trying to like appeal to the values of people. When I read Andrew Yang's War on Normal People, there was definitely a lot in there where he was really trying, but the framing, I don't think he quite hit the mark with the framing necessarily. Do you have and there is this tendency, like Austin was saying, that these arguments just seem to like take this plunge into these sectors of like talking about funding and cost and benefit and that sort of stuff. And you've witnessed 6 out of 7 of people like turn it in another direction. Do you have any recommendations for that approach from the perspective of talking about it politically, but also just in groups and with friends and that sort of thing, just to drive it in that direction, I guess? Is there any advice?
Well, it was very organic. Like, if you want, I can share with you like how I did it, and then you can put a group of friends in a room and see what happens. Because I did not steer the conversation at all. So in the first hour, so before they reached this conclusion, I was just sitting, and taking notes and listening. I did not interject at all in that conversation. But what I did before, so as they entered the room, I had, okay, you're here to discuss this question. And then I took 10 minutes to tell the participants what is a universal basic income. And the way I tried to do this, if you want, I can also share the slides that I use for my focus group, because I try to give the most simple, less value-laden definition of a basic income that I could find. And so I presented that. Okay, so this is the basics of a universal basic income. This is what you have to debate about. And then another slide had the two at the moment. So we're talking early 2019. The two emergent models for financing a universal basic income, which are very different. Like, One is all based on a redesign of the tax benefit system, and the other one is based on economic rents of the country, which is similar to a sovereign welfare fund concept. And I did not give a better, one is better than the other. And at the time, these were the only two factual research available here. So I put them, okay. And these are the ways in which it could be financed. But then I did that so they did not focus on the funding question. So I basically said, look, we have the money. Okay, we have the money. And these two models demonstrate how it can be funded. Okay, have a look at it, whatever, but this is not what we're talking about. So it's a situation in which we have the money to do it. We don't have the political will to do it, but we have the money to do it. Do you want it? So, and it was like 10 minutes. I think it was 3 or 4 slides. And then they went into discussion. And this is what came up. But again, it might go very different to different groups of people, but I did have a good variety there.
Justin's raised a question or a point in the chat. Justin, did you want to ask that to Loriana, or should I? Yeah, great. Go ahead.
So Bill Mitchell, who you may know about, he's one of the Australian academics who wrote the macroeconomics textbook. I see you've met him. Yeah, so he's concerned that one of the reasons why people like Elon Musk and others support UBI is they see the average person more as a unit of consumption rather than an independent actor in a modern society who has political and economic control and input. Yeah,
and I completely agree. Like all points, I am not naive in that sense. And we also have to take into account that we do live in a society where, and I'm not even going to talk into like post-truth and, pandemics and wars and crises, but we do live in a society where at least that's a perception, where there might be a decrease in critical thinking capacity, and this is it's not a cognitive limitation, it's due to the system in which we are living into, and we can go into social psychology and have a good look at what, the amount of information that we're fed, so the effect on our cognitive bandwidth of social media, the deterioration of trust, of institutional trust and collective trust. All of these elements have to be taken into account. And when you take them into account, of course, there might be fears that, well, actually, if we give a universal basic income in this context, like without changing anything else, like it is, we give money to people, there is a risk that people will just become even less critical and even just like consumer and just be part of, like, in a very passive way, which is the opposite of what a majority of universal basic income advocates advocate for, which is a vita activa, which is this concept of being actively engaged with the policy community.
So the problem would be that people had money, people were happy, and so no one wanted to hear Bill Mitchell talk about how bad capitalism is anymore. Is that the problem?
I don't think, I get philosophical here, because what do you mean about happiness? Happiness also is a very contextual term. So yes.
Bill Mitchell is one of my least favorite people in the universe, because he wants a job guarantee, which is the most nightmarish thing I've ever heard. It's this right to work rhetoric of the Republicans reinvented as if it's progressive. He's talked about the job guarantee, for example. He says it's like the wool buying scheme we used to have, where we used to buy heaps and heaps of bales of wool to support the price of wool, so that the market wouldn't collapse. And we just do this in the labor market. So we buy up all these people and put them in warehouses down by the docks, where they sit there for years and eventually get destroyed in an insurance fire. It's actually, so the basic argument of the left remains essentially Marxist and class struggle. And in that struggle, either you're a worker or you're a parasite free riding capitalist, right? And actually, it's an old version, it's a new, well, not that new. It's a modern version of a very, very old story about, who's lazy and who's working and who's earning their keep,
Mhm.
right? And so, I mean, leave aside the focus groups for a bit. I'd like to know what you think about this. What do you think that the narrative of the workerist narrative of the left
Mhm.
has, it offers us a path towards a basic income, I guess, or more generally, does it open doors or shut them?
So I will start by commenting on Bill Mitchell and work job guarantee. And I completely agree with you. I know this is part of the ongoing moralist and paternalistic attitude, not only of the socialist left, of the social democratic left as well. And let's not forget that the welfare system that we have, it is a compromise between social democratic values and capitalist values. And it is still very strongly centered around this work ethic, but work understood in a very narrow conception. And the moralism comes into, keep people working and thrift and so on, which comes more from the religious Calvinist tradition, which
Protestant work ethic, et cetera, et cetera.
And the whole, and the whole hated passions and emotions towards laziness. Or do we even stop and think, what is laziness? There is a use for laziness and boredom in our life, but it's demonized.
Before we're going to Justin in just a sec, I want to know, because I asked about your opinions then, was there anything in particular from the focus groups on this sort of issue of work that, what did you find on that topic in terms of free rider work concerns?
There was, like, as the deservingness, undeservingness debate that I mentioned before, there was also talk around the dignity of work. But what happened is that, and it occurred in almost all focus groups, but what happened is that then it was enlarged, to envision, yes, there is dignity in working, but this is why I said, like, the frame that emerged was self-worth through contribution. So there was a sense in which people were acquiring a sense of self-worth via contributing, but the notion of contribution was widened, so that really, like, you can contribute in whatever way. You're writing a book, you're contributing. You're watering the garden, you're contributing. But there was no, I'm thinking like anything came up, but well, no, actually there was also a sense of self-worth attached to states of being. And that was why the other deep frame, like human life has intrinsic value, came up. Recognition that people have value and there is a dignity, so self-worth attached to these values, even if they are just being, not doing. And that was radical. That was really radical to me, which I think it does tangentially touch on what you're saying.
So that was the guy who self-identified as a dole bludger. Was he saying, "I'm busy just being a dole bludger"?
No, it was not him.
It's Fry in Futurama. He said, he said the universe, you'll stop existing if you go back in time and kill your grandfather. And he says, but existing is all I do. I feel for him. And he had Justin.
So I just want to maybe suggest a counterpoint to what was suggested about Mitchell's position. Just before COVID, I saw him speak for quite a long time at Woodford, and he stayed around afterwards and talked at length with all the people who wanted to talk. One of the things that he suggested is that because obviously in our capitalist economy, everything is focused on generally on a profit incentive. So if work isn't generating a profit, it's not valued, and thus most people don't do it. And we do have a certain amount of NGOs and not-for-profits, but the real the real focus is on the capitalist, you Google, you Amazon, all these things, people, whether they're overly positive or not, it's about the profit incentive. And obviously, you want to avoid the issue of like, a communist kind of system where overly centralized systems become incredibly inefficient. And, but what the goal that he was talking about, some of the actual examples were, what do you do with surfers? Well, you have them teach swimming and surfing to kids. What do you do with musicians?
Hey,
well,
I know this because I remember reading this when this came out. Sorry to jump in, but I was unemployed in a town on the beach, right, with a small country town in New South Wales. I was out of work reading Bill Mitchell's thing about this, that you could have a surf school or you could run a music school. It's like, you know what? There's already one guy who runs the surf school and gives guitar lessons and runs a cafe, and he's providing all three of those services to this town, and he's still broke, right? So what are we going to do? I'm going to go and get subsidized to steal all of his surf lessons. Is that what's going to happen? So then he can get unemployed and we can both have a guaranteed job where we're now both paid to sit on the beach and like have one surf lesson, split the surf lessons half and half. Not that I can surf, obviously.
Well, also he's doing it with a profit motive, right? His customer base is a number of people who have the free time and who want to learn to surf and swim, all that kind of stuff. Whereas instead, we're saying everyone should learn to surf and swim. In Queensland, we're actually shipping kids from the bush to the beach and showing them how to swim and surf, and actually getting them to experience a broader part of Australian life.
If you gave those kids' parents money, they could pay the guy who's already got a business, and he could teach them to surf.
And that comes back to a question of culture, maybe. I've actually been trying to figure out an issue, kind of a compromise system where the government offers a lot of jobs at a certain rate. And for a certain number of years, you can go off and do a government job for a certain number of years. And then, on some kind of time scale, obviously you don't want people swapping it every 6 months, maybe you have it every 2 or 3 years or whatever. You give people the option to go into UBI and try their hand at being an entrepreneur or doing something for themselves. And then, that doesn't necessarily go well. They say, okay, give me a government job for a couple of years, not something nice and stable. But it's also, going back to the profit motive thing, we're not doing a lot of environmental repair that is necessary. In Australia and probably many other nations, we have all these old mines that are just empty holes in the ground because the company, sold itself off and, split into nothing, and there's no responsibility anymore. And so there's all this environmental repair that we should be doing. Well, I mean, if we're having governments telling people what to do, well, make a whole bunch of people into.
But why are we having governments tell people what to do, though? No one. That you just say, if we're having governments tell people what to do, basic income advocates say, don't have governments tell people what to do, right? That's the whole.
Okay, but
sorry, Loriana, I should let you respond.
So
Jane and Josh.
This is working on this balance idea of giving people the option of periodically moving backwards and forwards between these systems, because in a system where everyone's on UBI, how many people are going to self-organize and go and fill in a giant mine and revegetate the area? In many countries in the world,
you don't think people would? You don't think if people had a basic income in Brisbane and Queensland now, in the areas that have been flooded, they would be more or less likely to go and help their neighbours clean up?
So that's a different example. And we do see people turn out with the mud army and fix these problems. But that's a direct thing. They can see that there's mud everywhere. These people are their friends. But the threat of...
But people aren't capable of seeing beyond the horizon or understanding what's happening that they've heard about. They need to be economically compelled to do good things is the basis of it, right? So it seems like a very small and negative view of human nature that informs this. And I want to throw to Loriana to get her response. I'm sorry, I've jumped in a couple of them.
No, I love the passion in there. And before addressing it, I just wanted to point out before, Austin, as you were talking about your experience unemployed on the beach, that you did it again. You used a defensive frame, to justify your point. You were like, well, there is already someone doing it, so that's why I'm not doing it, instead of putting forward, well, why would I have to do it? So that was just that parenthesis. And yeah, so this is again the the big division, one of the big division within the left. That is, like, some people would argue that you still need some centralized system to tell people what to do or not to do, because otherwise they wouldn't see the incentive into do good for the collective. And I guess what I've been trying to argue with my research is that I think these values are only there, but if we keep on framing policies that reinforce this selfish, individualistic view of citizens that need to be controlled and told what to do, we are not, in fact, exploiting the full potential of a universal basic income, which is just leap of faith, trust in their autonomy, and see what happens. And so this is like kind of starting to address that. And also something else that came up in your response before, Austin, you see how our own views are informed by underlying assumptions and values. And what you refer to is a very negative, and this is like Darwinian, part of the evolutionary theory view that we believe, men just being competitive and, struggle for survival, and the survival of the fittest, and all of this, so that unless you coerce people in some way, like in soft or in hard ways, you will not get the collective result. And instead, I think what we don't talk enough about, and what we've been witnessing throughout the COVID pandemic, but in so many other circumstances, and people standing up to defend rights of minority, go on and regenerate forests. Like, there are so many initiatives happening, but they are sparse and they don't get attention. And so this is why that, we are not reinforcing that kind of narrative. Actually, people might be interested in regenerating the mines, but, and just to end, yeah, it's, the job guarantee, this is what I would say, like the job guarantee of basic income, why not both? Like, so that people would still feel, and there is, again, so many other explanation and justification for that could still feel, what, I want someone that tells me what to do, okay? And you have someone that tells you what to do, and you run and do it. And other people are like, I don't need anyone to tell me what to do. So I don't see this too.
Some people are like, I want to tell other people what to do. Yes. And those people love a job guarantee. Sorry. Josh. Oh, Jane, Josh is deferring to Jane. Jane, please go ahead. Josh had his hand up, then he took it down, then he put it up again. So he lost his spot in the queue. Jane, you'll need to unmute.
Sorry, I'm slow on the unmute. I've been bursting for years with this one-liner. You gave a lovely one-liner about people who are endlessly asking how we can afford it. Who owns the work? I'm choking as I say it. We don't ask this question. And so much policy is driven by this thing, oh, it's going to provide jobs. We need the jobs. I mean, something like 30% of the Victorian workforce was owned by Crown Casino. What is the point of that work? It does nothing but harm to anybody as work. It may provide some pay, which provides some benefit for workers, but the work per se does nothing but create human misery and economic ruin. So we really have to ask, who owns the work? What is the work, and what is it for? And one of the massive benefits of a basic income is it puts that question back where it belongs, front and center. And I think it goes together. You can't really pursue a serious basic income idea without doing it alongside this question of what is work. It should be an open question. Just as Loriana managed those focus groups as an open question, get people really involved in thinking that through and freeing the imagination to decide what the work is. And some of it will not be a choice. I mean, if you're in an emergency, certain kinds of work are an imperative. and you can argue that from a planetary point of view, we are in an emergency. Those trash islands, who's going to clean them up? And they say, well, who's going to pay for it? Well, if the bulk of the population are actually supported with a basic income, they can collectively take on responsibility much more effectively. They can control planning as groups. Okay, that's my rant. Thank you.
Loriana, did you want to respond?
No, like I completely, absolutely agree. That is, yeah, and I've always loved and appreciated Jane's work, and particularly the angle that Jane, you've been taking about basic income and this concept of the need is the really survival as a species need to focus on current emergencies, among which recycling and waste, etc. So yeah.
I just want to add on that point. One of the big things about the environment, like to protect the environment, is to stop doing things as well, right? It's important to do certain things. It's also important to stop doing things like, commuting to work for a job that you hate, that you've got to do so you don't starve. And then there's all this. And once we start creating this work, all of these businesses require real inputs, right? Which require more work, which require businesses, which require real inputs, right? We have this tendency to bloat, and we lean into it by wanting to find work for everybody. And it's urgent to not do certain things as well. Josh, you're next.
So at our monthly action meetings, we're always looking for things that we can do to make a basic income a reality. You've had a great suggestion, which is to rephrase the debate. I'm curious, this is out of the scope of what you want to talk about, but do you have any other tips of things that we can do to get us to where we want to be?
Yeah, so one is reframing, and it's reframing around core values. So one of my recommendations is the thesis is talk values as much as you talk evidence. In fact, talk values even more than facts and evidence. Engage with these deeper values. So that's the framing one. And then, of course, the second recommendation is the list that I produced about ineffective framings. So again, try and avoid rationalistic, techno, blah, blah. And the third one, which is very important, is think, like as a movement, I think in Australia, like other countries are already formulating this, particularly universal basic income, Europe, start to have serious debates with other constituencies, interests, civil society about what is the policy package. Okay, what is the policy package? Because the more you're able to offer to people a coherent, comprehensive story that they can understand, the more like solid you appear on your framing on this story. And look, it's universal basic income plus this, minus this, okay? And then we all know that, it's always a work in progress, and you have to accommodate differences, and you don't want to colonize these differences. But as you go about and say a story to the larger public, which does not have time or interest to invest in how about if we do it like this or like this, like often people, they just want a solution or at least a series, like a couple of options. Okay. And then they can think to themselves, yes. But if we don't start to coalesce around what do we mean by universal basic income is not a silver bullet solution? What do we mean by universal basic income policy package? That is another very important thing to start and establish.
Stephen.
Yeah, I guess it ties into that, is how do you prepare people for what follows the implementation of a UBI? Like, because I see there's going to be less jobs in the future than there are now. So how do you kind of tell that to people when people are so used to hearing, oh, we're creating jobs, 100,000 jobs created this month, and like everyone says, yay, that's good. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh no, we're not going to be doing that anymore. Even though we've designed our whole society around jobs at the center of it, we're going to try to undo that just kind of magically by implementing UBI and everyone will just, kind of sort themselves out. But they're still thinking, wait, hang on, aren't we all jobs and growth, or are we volunteering now, or what are we doing? Like, I don't know.
That's a great question, and that has been attracting a lot of debate and scholarly and non-scholarly work. And this is why it's so important to have these discussions before any implementation. So first of all, because in really practical and pragmatic terms, unless you live in a dictatorship, which, well, I will not even start to talk about what system we live into, but, it's highly unlikely that a universal basic income is introduced top down by someone. So for like, if it's bottom up, it's organic, like it's normal that these conversations would have been around for some time before you can see this actually implemented. And in this some time, people might have started to think about what do we mean by work? What do we mean by contribution, etc. So this might happen very organically, and this is really often beyond any social engineering geniuses, because that's how society, very complex society works. So,
just a quick one. I'll give you an aggressive policy. Like you cut financial services jobs in half. Just cut them in half because they're not necessary. They're very highly paid. They're just soaking up money. Like that's something very, blunt or whatever. And like society would be fine, but that, it'd never be very difficult.
Yeah, and there are so many jobs that could be eliminated, within 24 hours. But I guess the point, and this is also interesting because it did come up with my focus groups, is that people were not naive, they did think about some of the risks that you mentioned. So what if tomorrow we give a basic income to everyone? What is going to happen, And among the services, and this, Josh, maybe links a bit back to your question before, among the services in which they did see a role for the state was in offering services that could empower people and help them into transitioning from a state of dependency to a state of independency, providing skills to start and see each other as a bit more entrepreneur of the self, rather than being told what to do since the moment we're born, since the moment we die.
This is the bit that a lot of people on the left don't like, when you just said entrepreneur of the self. And they don't like the idea that because that's dirty and immoral, and people shouldn't want to be entrepreneurs, and they shouldn't aspire to having a pool or a car. They should all just want to work at the factory and get exactly the fair amount of money for tightening screws at the assembly line for Russia. It's this tired old thing where people are only supposed to want what they deserve, and they only deserve what they contribute, and you contribute by rolling up your sleeves and putting in with the group,
Austin, that's another limitation. This is beautiful how language is always co-opted by power, language is the means to which power is enacted. And if people from the left, and I know, and I use, even in my research, I use the word entrepreneur of the self on purpose, because even the way we have conceptualized the word entrepreneur, and we have attached it to this very predatory. If you look at entrepreneur, it's like whoever runs an enterprise. And what is an enterprise? Now, again, we narrowed enterprise, what an enterprise is, something that you are within, that you're doing within. So an enterprise, if you look at what is an enterprise,
like a starship.
Exactly. No, but you could even, if you don't want to be part of this, of the dirty, profit-driven, and it is certainly like this, that it's a predatory system which we live, but you want to live on your own terms, having your own veggie garden, getting away with money and all monetary interaction, and you can do it, and you would still be an entrepreneur of the self.
Yeah, but can I just, if I'm smart, why don't I just work for a bank and get 180 grand a year? Why would I just Why would I plant a vegetable garden?
Yes, you could do that as well. You could, and that's why, again, talking values, it's so important. You know,
I don't think any bank could pay you 180 grand, Stephen.
If I'm smart enough, they will. They'll come straight to me and they'll pluck me out of university if I'm a brainiac.
I've got a friend who's working at a bank. Who did a PhD in pure math. They don't get paid as much as you think. Not in Australia, anyhow. This is not it's not the high seas of finance that people still have to go to New York to you know, do all the cocaine and have the wild parties, like, for real, you know.
You also have to like survive the hazing period and not have a mental breakdown and all of those things too, if you go into that field.
So they're magically living in inner Sydney, these guys. They've just magically conjured real estate or whatever, working in finance.
Yeah. So this question of the entrepreneurial self and the enterprise, right? And being engaged in things. I've always thought that one example of of high value workers. Look at these people who live in Silicon Valley and can are very in demand engineers in Silicon Valley. One of the things that they all demand is they all demand shares in the company and a ride to work and free lunch, right? And what I imagine is that if we all had a basic income, we'd all be like those douchebags in Silicon Valley, and we'd all say, well, if you want me to work at your company, there has to be shares. There has to be a share option, so I have to get some ownership of the company. You're going to have to cover my transport or let me work from home or do what I want, right? But that I feel like that a lot of the left feel like if you go, yeah, you might get all these nice things, but what of your soul, right?
Yeah, and I think, you see, I go back to this point. I think this is why it's so important to talk about values, you know, and this will, the values that we see driving a universal basic income society will differ greatly, not just from nation to nation, but within nations as well. And, you know, some people wish for, you know, universal basic income that will decentralize, you know, the whole state apparatus, you know, and so that becomes like smaller, semi-autonomous realities, you know, which everyone receives a basic income. But, you know, like, I don't know, in your community, you are more like the Silicon Valley guys pursuing these goals and values and blah, blah, blah. And this community is more like that, you know, that this is another option that it could be. But, you know, if we don't engage in
it would create space. It would create space for communal lifestyles, like what we traditionally call entrepreneurial lifestyles. Yeah. When, you know, more people would go in. Absolutely, I think more people would go into startups and film and all of the industries which people find exciting. You know, there'd be more people would be failing and writing a lot of bad poetry too, right?
Yes. And more people, like, going back to the point that Jane made before, you see, like, we risk ourselves that we think straight away, oh, universal basic income, I'm just going to find the way to, you know, to make the most money, you know, to be the most successful. That is not given. Not necessarily everyone thinks like this or see those as the primary goals of life to be pursued. So, you know, we all have to be very careful of overgeneralization. And as you said, that is one, obviously, of the main criticism from the left. Why? Because it relies on this very negative view of human nature, a human being. So, and of course, you have the fear, well, this is what's going to happen. We do not know what's going to happen. We really do not know what's going to happen. And this is why the more you can talk values and the more you can engage people in, like, help people retrain into having deep, meaningful conversations, the more you have to do that first. Otherwise, and just to finish up on this answer, I often use this analogy that was used by Erich Fromm. So it was, very famous German psychoanalyst of the 60s. And at the time, they did not call it universal basic income. It was, I think, income guarantee of some other language. And he looked at it from a psychological perspective, because, of course, back then, as today, there is all this fear. Oh, what happens if you just give money for free to people. And he used this analogy, like, well, it would be like for a child. So you've raised a child, and the way that you've conditioned him to, or her, to clean the bedroom was like, okay, if you clean the bedroom, I'm going to give you candy. So, you made this conditioning. You do this first, your duty first, and then I will reward you with a candy. And this is our relationship to money, right? And this is why we are wage slaves. It's like, you work hard, and then I reward you with $1. So it's like, once you break this relationship, so if you go one day to the child that has been used to always see, you could only have the candy if you had cleaned the room. One day you go to the child with a bag of candies. What will most likely happen is that the child will get sick on the candies. He will get sick on the candies, but then once he realizes that he can have these candies anytime, anywhere, they lose that that charm, that fascination, that like, oh, well, actually, these candies are not that, like, I don't crave them so much anymore because I don't know, they're always there. So what can I do today? And then he goes out playing, and do that stuff. And that's like from a very like simple analogy, psychologically and also on an individual and collective scale, what might happen? If you just give people, people like will probably go into any extreme of behavior for a period and then kind of reassess, oh, okay, well, actually I can do this with this money and this time. So also, are we ready as a society to allow for this adjustment period? What do we do in the adjustment period? And these are real conversations that we have to have. Like, I think few of us think of other of human beings as pure evil or pure angelic figures. Like, we all sit somewhere in the middle. So.
I was thinking when you were talking about this, what will people do? What will people do? Is sort of first, one of my concerns is, well, why is it your who is asking, and would you like to go fuck yourself about what other people will do? Right? There's a little bit of, because it reminded me of this thought where there's the missionaries in South America, and they were talking about the indigenous people in the jungle, and they're like, if we don't destroy the jungle, if we don't clear the land, right, we'll never get them to work for us, because they are able to they're able to subsist off the land directly, off the jungle, so they don't need anything from us, so we have to destroy it, right? And we have to force them into the monetary economy, and a lot of people, like Bill Mitchell was brought up earlier as well, they have this narrative in modern monetary theory about, oh, well, the British, they went into Africa and no one would work at the rubber plantations. It's an apocryphal story, but there's some basis. So they said, we're going to go around and burn all the huts unless you pay us a tax in shillings, and the only way to get shillings is go work at the rubber plantation, right? So there's this narrative, they understand there's this narrative of sort of violent capture of the workforce, right? But then the response to it is, so then let's make the prison that we've all been captured in a little bit more comfortable, a little bit fairer, make sure the work's sort of more evenly spread out, right? I should say quickly, if anyone else has a question, we're going to wrap up soon, so put your hand up, don't miss your chance. But I mean, one of the things, I'll be a little bit critical. I'll put your PhD to the test. Is there an implicit assumption that the job of basic income advocates is to reach this public and to somehow mobilize this public, right? Which is perhaps putting pointing the spotlight in the wrong direction. And maybe the problem is it's the political class, it's the activists, it's the culture around, we could call it the union academia industrial complex, right? That is actually where the blockage is, and that people are ready. We're not ready.
That is very, very interesting. I think our efforts should be should be taking place in both areas. Having these conversations and trying to create a stronger grassroots movement, but at the same time being aware. And this is why, I do not recommend, my PhD does not talk to existing political parties. because I do recognize that existing political parties are part of the problem. And so the way that, so the implicit assumption, and it's not even so implicit because it's part of the theory of hegemony that I use, is that, this movement needs to be created bottom up to then give a representation, like, so that people can see and be represented. If you want to talk representative democracy, that's what we have now, but it could even be another system, but so it needs to come up as something new, something different. It does not have necessarily to be tied to the Greens party or responding to the Labour Party. It could be its own identity. And this is why, my whole thesis, it's about how do you create this story? How do you create this narrative? How do you offer something radically different? Because
could the basic income movement be to the 21st century what the Labour movement was to the 19th and 20th century?
Yeah, it could. And I think that's the power of utopian thinking. The power of utopian thinking is like, and everything needs to be imagined before it becomes a reality. But if we never, if we just remain in this world of ideas and we don't try to do something active, yes, it will remain an utopia, but then it would be our own limitation. And because a lot of people, like in the years that kept on talking about universal basic income, and everyone's like, oh, it's never going to happen. Oh, yeah, it's wishful thinking. Oh, yes, I wish it was. Well, and it's I always say, plant the seed, even if you're not going to see the tree. It might not happen. In fact, it's highly likely that we will not see it in our generation, or not to the full extent of what it might achieve, because we are really talking about generational cultural shifts. But then where is our responsibility in this? Should we just sit comfortably and cry on ourselves? Oh, this world is falling apart. There is nothing we can do. But
do we need this generational cultural shift? If 6 out of 7 of the groups came down in favor of the basic income, then isn't the culture ready? Is it not just pure institutional atrophy why is the problem culture if people are already agreeing?
Yeah, I just answered and see Josh. Yes, so the culture might be ready, okay, but then it still takes historical time for some things to be broken down and rebuilt, and I see also, like, I would just like to end on this, like what we are currently living, it's not new, but we're seeing certainly some heightened outcomes and effects. It's a collapse, that has been ongoing. It's been a very long, slow death. It's a huge collapse, and I'm like, and this is why it's such a fertile time for universal basic income and other movements. Just build your story, build your movement, and let this thing, those institutions, academics included, let it all fall, and then of course be part of it falling if you want to help, but then also focus on what are you proposing? What is the alternative? Give hope to people, right? Give a vision.
I think that's a wonderful note for us to wrap up on. Thank you very much. Soon to be Dr. Loriana Luccioni.
I will let you know. I will advertise it everywhere.
Awesome. Thanks everyone else for coming. Great questions. Another wonderful, fun episode with everyone.
Thank you.